Welcome to KPI's The Mystery of a Recipe. As we discussed in our previous video, the mystery of your operational difficulties, we will now apply our mystery method to an example most of us are more familiar with, a food recipe. Looking at our mystery, there are a couple of basic questions we want to ask. First, what is a recipe? A recipe is a set of instructions that describes how to prepare or make something, especially food. Though recipes come in many forms, they generally follow a format. Recipes will generally provide certain information: the name of the dish, cook time, prep time, number of servings, ingredients, preparations, and instructions on how to cook the dish. Recipes are typically laid out in terms of sequential order. The ingredients are listed in the order that they are used, and the steps are laid out in the order that they are performed. The question of whether or not certain steps can be done in parallel is typically left for the reader to discern for themselves, though some recipes are better than others when it comes to that. For the purpose of example, we are going to look at a recipe for broccoli and chicken stir-fry. This recipe and image comes courtesy of the Food Network by way of Pat and Gina Neely, co-stars of the cooking show Down Home with the Neelys. As we saw in our recipe format, this recipe provides us with the prep time, cook time, and number of servings. It also provides us with a measure of the difficulty of this recipe, which is easy. By many cooking standards, I would agree with their assessment of difficulty, but we need to remember that it is not the assessment of the recipe provider that makes this process successful, but the assessment of the cook. With a difficulty level assessment of easy, you could imagine an inexperienced cook finding this recipe and wanting to give it a try. Since I am a relatively inexperienced cook myself, I did just that. Continue down the path and see how an inexperienced cook might approach this recipe. Here we have a list of all the ingredients that go into this recipe. Assuming our cook needs to go grocery shopping, he or she would need to go through the list of ingredients, look at what they have in their refrigerator, freezer, cabinets, and/or pantry, figure out what they need to buy, and then purchase them on their next grocery shopping trip. Are there any ingredients here that would not be obvious to find when taking a trip through a grocery store? Well, garlic bought at the store is typically sold in bulbs, which contain multiple cloves. If you were to use multiple bulbs of garlic as opposed to multiple cloves of garlic in this recipe, it's safe to say it's going to change the flavor of your dish. Chicken, when bought at the store, is typically sold whole, and you would have to do the cutting into pieces at home. Ginger, bought at the store, would be peeled and chopped at home, but bought whole. Same for green onions, the slicing would need to be done at home. Broccoli bought at the store is typically in one of two forms. You can buy it fresh, in a whole form, or you can buy it frozen, in which case you can buy florets in the frozen form. You would just need to thaw them before going through the blanching process. The layout of the directions suggests that there are 4 processes in this recipe. 1. Make the sauce. 2. Cook the chicken. 3. Saute the vegetables. And 4. Put it all together. This is how they get to their 10-minute cook time. It seems simple enough. Now we will bring our recipe into our mystery methodology. It is important to remember that every mystery has the following core elements: characters, setting, plot, clues, assumptions, distractions, structure, and conclusion. We will find these elements in our mystery as well. We will go into each of these in more detail. Now let's take a look at the characters in our mystery. Let's start with the main characters, of which there are 3 types: the victims, investigators, and the suspects or culprits. In the case of the victim, and which is really just the recipient of the problem or the possible recipient of the solution, there really is no past or present victim in cooking a meal. It's really just the future victim, which would be the people who will be served this food. Now, if the food's really bad, you can truly say these folks are victims. Next, let's take a look at the investigators, or the proponents of the solution. In our case, the lead investigator would be the cook. The investigative team might be the buyer of the groceries, if it's not the cook, an assistant cook, if there is one, the owner of the kitchen, cookware, utensils, or appliances, if they don't belong to the cook. And lastly, let's take a look at the suspects and the culprits. These would be the proponents of the problem. Well, in this case, we have a known problem, which is hunger. So we want to know, will the victims be hungry? And if so, we want to make sure that we're pleasing their palate. Palate meaning what types of foods they like, what tastes do they enjoy. So we need to ask the question, do the victims like broccoli? Do they like chicken? And do they like stir-fried foods? Additionally, we can look at other characters in this mystery, which might include the ingredients, the grocery store where the ingredients were purchased, as well as the kitchen, the cookware, the utensils, and the appliances used to prepare this dish. Now let's take a look at the setting of our mystery. So when does it happen? Well, first, let's look at our problem. Our problems, in this case, are hunger, the desire for food, and palate, an interest in specific types of food. So for hunger, we're going to say that happens multiple times every day, which is typically addressed by one or more meals a day. We happen to be fixing a dish for one of those meals, dinner, at 7 o'clock. Our other problem here is palate, which is, do our victims or do the people we're serving this food to like certain types of foods? And in this case, we're going to say that they do enjoy broccoli and chicken and stir-fried foods. These are things they enjoy, though they probably wouldn't like to eat the same thing every day. So, as a solution, we are going to serve a dinner of broccoli and chicken stir-fry to our victims at or around 7 p.m. So next, where does the problem happen? Well, with regard to our problems, hunger and palate are really independent of place. The desire to eat, the desire of what you want to eat, and the liking of certain foods are pretty constant across location. So next, let's take a look at it in terms of our solution. Well, we will cook the meal in our kitchen, complete with a stove. Another thing that's worth noting is that this kitchen where we're cooking is in the United States. And the reason for that is the measurements in the recipe are using U.S. standard measurement. If we were in a metric measurements, we would have to readjust our recipe to accommodate for the metric system. It is possible that we could not cook this meal in our employee kitchen or break room. We may have some difficulty cooking this meal in a hotel room, and we absolutely could not cook this meal anywhere that does not have a stove, or at least a very big and very strong hot plate. So, how does this problem happen? Well, remember, our problems are hunger and palate, and hungry just happens. It's part of the human condition. It happens on a daily basis. There's any number of reasons why someone might be more or less hungry at a given time, but it's safe to say that having a desire to eat is going to happen fairly constantly. With regard to the palate, well, we'll just say that for our victims, at some point in their life, they decided that they like stir-fried foods, and they had both broccoli and chicken and decided those were good as well. So, this is where we are addressing our problem. But one thing worth noting, while it seems obvious, not everyone likes broccoli, not everyone likes chicken, and not everyone likes stir-fried foods. Now, if our victims did not like one or more of the above, this would be a very poor solution to their palate. But, for our purpose of example, they do. So, with our solution, we're going to cook a meal for them using the ingredients, the techniques, and the directions given in the recipe. Looking at our plot, we want to examine what our problem is. Well, again, we have two problems. One is hunger, the other is palate. We're making the assumption that there will be people who will be hungry at some point in the future, and those people have a palate that enjoys broccoli, chicken, and stir-fried foods. So we want to look at how do we get our clues? Well, thankfully, this is a recipe, so we should, and I'm making those fictitious bunny ears for should be able to find everything we need in this recipe. If there's something we need to find outside of the recipe, we can look in a number of different sources. One might be to go back to foodnetwork.com, which is the source of the recipe. Another might be to do a search on Google or Wikipedia. Or if you happen to have one available, a good reference cookbook should answer most any question you have. Lastly, we want to identify which clues are important. Now, since this is a recipe, it's probably safe to say that if they wrote it down, it's important. Now, the question we want to ask here is, are there any things that they didn't write down that might be important? Now let's look to the clues of our mystery. The important thing to remember here is that information is king. What information do we have? Well, we've got the recipe with its ingredients and its directions. Are there any information that we don't already have? We would have to scan the recipe to see if any part of it doesn't make sense. You always want to see the problem, or in this case, the solution for yourself. This recipe was put together by professionals. They aren't thinking about what is obvious or oblivious to them. For example, they call for measurements. Half a tablespoon, full tablespoon, 2 tablespoons, 1 cup, and 1 pound. Well, in order to measure these, we would need measuring spoons, a measuring cup, and a food scale if we want to be exact about that pound of chicken. Is there anything they've included that you immediately understand? Well, let's take a look at the ingredient subprocesses. For one, we have a pound of boneless, skinless chicken thighs cut into half-inch pieces. Okay, so what kind of knife should we use to cut it? And what should we cut it on? Can I use a butter knife on my kitchen counter? Probably not your best course of action. They also ask for 2 tablespoons of peeled and chopped ginger. Well, what should I peel it with? And what kind of knife do I use to chip? Is ginger just like peeling an orange? Nope, you're going to want a vegetable peeler. And they also mention 4 green onions sliced. Okay, what kind of knife should I use for slicing green onions? You probably want to go with a sharp one here. Lastly, they speak of 2 cups of broccoli florets blanched. Well, if I brought my broccoli whole, what's a floret and how do I create one? What is this blanching process all about? Well, take a look at the directions and let's see what they specify that hasn't already been captured. Well, they mention using a small bowl, a whisk, and a wok. Well, a small bowl is a small bowl. Any bowl will do. But they also mention a whisk for mixing. Is it necessary to have a whisk to mix something? No, not really. You can use a fork or a spoon. And they also specify a wok. Now, a wok is fairly standard with stir-frying food, but it's not absolutely necessary. You can use any frying pan. And lastly, we want to call in the experts. So if there is still questions about the explicit or implicit directions of the recipe, you want to check with other sources, which again could be foodnetwork.com, a search on Google or Wikipedia, a reference cookbook that you have handy, or you can choose the route that I went, which is simply to ask a more experienced cook. Now let's take a look at the assumptions of our mystery. Don't predetermine the scope. The scope of the recipe says that it makes 3 to 4 servings. But what if I need to feed 6 to 8 or more people? Well, completing this recipe once would not be enough, and adjustments would need to be made to the quantities to make more than one of this dish. Not all ingredients need to or should be directly multiplied to make more than one dish. For example, cooking oil is highly variable depending on the lube condition of the pan. The measurements in this recipe use U.S. customary units of measurement, tablespoon, pound, and cup. But what if I wanted to make this recipe in a country that uses the metric system? We would have to convert all of the measurements to metric. We may also need to find out the translated names of those ingredients if we're not in a predominantly English-speaking country. Are there ingredients in this list that are replaceable? So, for instance, if peanut oil is not available, are there other oils that you can stir fry with? If light brown sugar is not available, would dark brown sugar work? And also, are there ingredients that you can do without and not substantially change the resulting dish? So if I didn't have green onions, but cooked the rest of the ingredients, it would still be very good. If I didn't have chicken, it really wouldn't be the same. We want to make sure so as not to accept another scope. The recipe says that the difficulty level of this is easy. If you have little to no experience with cooking, this may not be easy at all. There's measuring, there's chopping, peeling, and frying. The cook time looks as though it's solid, but the prep time is highly variable, depending on the skills of the cook. And lastly, what are the untrue facts? Well, this recipe calls for medium-high heat when you're adjusting your stove. Depending on the power of your stove, whether it's gas or electric, and the condition of your wok or frying pan, medium-high heat may mean different things. If your stove runs hotter than average, you may have to shoot for a lower heat setting or adjust your cooking time down so that you don't risk burning your food. If your stove doesn't run as hot, you may have to shoot for a higher heat setting or adjust your cooking time up so that you don't risk serving uncooked chicken. Distractions tend to be one of the more overlooked aspects of any mystery, but really those competing priorities can make the difference in how quickly it's resolved and how good your solution turns out to be. So let's take a look at what priorities might compete for your time and your attention as you put this solution together. For instance, are there family or friends in the house, or might you get a phone call? Do you have hungry customers waiting for this food? As a parent of young children, I can tell you, when they're hungry, there's pressure. Are you anticipating an important phone call? Or is there a television event on, news program, sporting event? Or, if we just go to the basic of all distractions, are you likely to get a call in nature while you're going through the cooking process? Any and all of these can distract you, and you want to make sure to limit those as best you can. A good rule of thumb is that nothing aids a problem or diverts from a solution like a distracted focus. Now let's take a look at the structure of our mystery. First, we want to make sure that we're understanding our victims. This is also known as the voice of the customer. So what does the customer want? Well, they want a meal, but they also want some other things to go with that meal. They want a meal that suits their tastes and is delicious, so of superlative quality. They want a fully cooked meal, which is simply a quality of the cooking. They want a just cooked meal, so they want it fresh. They want a meal that will sate their hunger, so it has to be of sufficient quantity. And they want the meal to come when they're hungry, so it has to be on time or timely. Next, let's understand the motive, otherwise known as the voice of the process. So what does the process want to accomplish? Well, the process wants to cook a meal. And they want to cook a meal that will satisfy their customer, so on time, sufficient quantity, and good quality. But they also want to delight their customer, so they want to be fresh and they want to be very delicious or superlative quality. And lastly, let's understand our culprits, and by this we want to talk about the voice of the business. And what they want is, again, a meal. But they also want that meal to sate the hunger of the customers, sufficient quantity. They want a meal that suits their tastes, of the right quality. And they want the meal to come when their customers are hungry, meaning it must be on time or timely. Lastly, we want to take a look at the conclusion to our mystery. We always want to catch the problem before it happens. So in this case, we want our solution to be ready before the problem gets bigger. Both our victim, customer, and our culprit, business, want the solution when the customer is hungry. Now, we originally set as our serving goal at or around 7 p.m. Well, what happens if the customer is hungry before 7 p.m.? This would require the cooking to start in advance of your original start time. It's worth noting that some processes can be done well in advance of need, depending on the needs of your customer. Had they not requested that the food be just cooked or fresh, you could have cooked a day in advance and simply reheated the food. Not advisable for stir fry, but it can be done. Well, what if your customer is not hungry at 7 and they want to eat later? This might mean that your dish would sit and cool and then need to be reheated by some means. But mostly, What if your preparation and/or cooking take longer than you expected? Well, if you're working backward from your timeline, did you leave yourself some lag time to accommodate for extra time in preparation or cooking? We want to take a look at how the problem is addressed. As we mentioned in our previous video, there are three ways to address a problem: defense, detainment, or destruction. As our problem and culprit is hunger, which is never permanently sated, this method of problem solving, cooking and serving a meal, is really more detainment, which means it will hold the hunger at bay for a time. Additional problems we want to take a look at is the recipe mentions transferring all of the dish into a serving bowl. Serving. Well, are we going to provide individual serving plates and bowls and utensils? This would seem an obvious step, but you would witness the impact very quickly if you were serving 6 to 8 people and only had 4 place settings. Another is, will this dish alone be enough, or should I also serve a side dish? If the recipe makes the assumption of this dish as a main dish, with side dishes to be served alongside, you may find that your 3 to 4 servings are not enough to sate the hunger of 3 to 4 people. And given that this is a stir-fried dish, you want to serve it immediately after cooking, which doesn't give you a whole lot of time for a side dish. Also, do we have somewhere for all of our guests to sit, preferably together, to enjoy the meal? This is not a stated issue of the customer or of the business, but it may be an implicit requirement for enjoying the meal. No one wants to feel put out by eating apart from everyone else. And lastly, we want to take a look at the aftermath. So, was everyone satisfied with the meal? If the recipe directions, both explicit and implicit, were followed, the stated needs met, and the implicit desires of the customer satisfied, the answer should be yes. Some variations may be acceptable. For instance, if you were to serve anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes after 7, or provide more food than is needed, or the food had to be reheated for serving purposes, that might be acceptable by your customers. However, there are some variations that have the potential to destroy the positive impact of everything else. For instance, if you undercooked or overcooked food, or if there were not enough place settings or seats, or not enough food. Those things are simple enough by themselves to destroy the impact of every other positive in the process. So ultimately, we want to say, were the victims or the customers better off with the solution? Well, if they received enough food to sate their hunger and it met their palate requirements, that is a win. Thank you for taking part in this presentation, and we look forward to helping you drive your performance to new levels in the future.